Once the hanging pods were well underway, with about a year left before the show, it was time to focus once more on the Holdables. Way back at the beginning, I had started experimenting and I had a lot of plans for interesting forms. These seem pretty straightforward once they're completed in front of you, but there were a lot of challenges involved in actually making them. Once you've envisioned the form you want, you also have to decide how you want it to act, for want of a better word. The pliability or rigidity of the sculpture, whether it's concave or convex, how the pattern pieces are shaped, and what order to stitch them in, are all huge things to consider. It's a lot of creative problem solving. I'll show you a few of the ways I approach the Holdables. First, the mushroom is a radially symmetrical piece, so all the pattern pieces are the same. The way I manipulated the pattern after I stitched it really mattered in this case. Both the cap and stem sides fold back towards the inside, making hollow areas in the top and bottom. In this cross-section drawing, you see how I had to stitch through and attach these two cave-like areas to each other. Otherwise, the stuffing, in this case packing peanuts and other styrofoam bits, would shift around and the negative areas could pop out to become positive areas, making a very different overall sculpture. Those concave areas are tricky if you're aiming for a squishy, pliable form. The sewn skin is very flexible, so a piece could turn out very differently depending on how and where you stuff it, and how stationary or rigid that stuffing is. In any case, this piece fits nicely on the head, in either orientation. To make a firmer sculpture that would only distort a little when a person sits on it, I started with a core of foam rubber. For this chair piece, I know, another unimaginative name, but my goal here was simply to identify them, I found a rather boring foam rubber chair and changed it. I made some big alterations, and then contoured the planes using a blade. I cut out and stitched the felt layer over it, trying to use as few pattern pieces as possible to keep the design clean and streamlined. In this case, the construction was like upholstering rather than making a complicated stuffed animal. I was covering over a finished shape. I had to develop a sense of how much the foam rubber would distort as I trimmed it and stitched the pieces together for a smooth skin. Especially as I come down to the last few pieces, I'm having to cut the different edges to make sure that they all fit and I don't have too much excess when I get to the corners. You can see that this one looks like it's pretty far off, but by the time I get there, it'll be squished together a little bit. So it's a lot of stitching under tension, and I'm using a curved needle so I can go in through the industrial felt, come out the other side, and just get a little bite of it to really pull it all together. I really love the swooping planes of the finished piece. I wanted to have some regular geometric shapes to contrast and balance out the organic Holdables, and for those I turned to styrofoam forms. I sourced blocks of styrofoam from several places: scraps from a 3D sign and effects company, donations from a nearby packaging store, and scrounged from my neighbor's recycling. To alter and shape these forms, I could carve and sand the solid ones, or with these hollow coolers, I could cut away and then fill the empty voids with scraps of foam or expanding foam from a can. Some of these styrofoam core pieces had inset areas, but since I was again upholstering over a firm shape, I didn't have to worry about the concave areas popping out into convex shapes. The regularity and rigidity of these pieces also meant they would be easily stackable and allow for arrangements to grow vertically in the museum. This final example of holdable construction brings together both the stuffed animal-like felt skin and a rigid interior. I was working at home using paper to mock up some ideas, and when I folded over a letter O-like shape, my son noticed that the piece could rock from side to side. I loved the idea of a more kinetic full body experience. I made a model with the symmetry a little off for irregular rocking motion. I figured out what the top and bottom pieces would be like and scaled it up to be big enough for people to sit or lay on. I knew with this piece I would need it to be rigid and solid, but still lightweight, and I didn't have a huge block of styrofoam to carve. Plus, I wanted the curved felt pattern to really determine the form. So my solution was to stitch the skin and then fill it with expanding spray foam. I used the kind of gaps and cracks filler you could find at the hardware store. I had to add it in layers, letting it cure and set before adding more, and filling up space with blocks of styrofoam too. This is the one product I feel like I should apologize for. The rest of my materials are relatively eco-friendly, even if it's just that I'm recycling or reusing foam that already exists and would otherwise be in a landfill. When it was full, I trimmed off the excess foam, which again I saved to stuff inside other sculptures, and cut the top felt piece to stitch it in place. Tasks like cutting away the edge of the felt where it needs to exactly meet other surfaces may not seem like a boatload of excitement, but it's extremely difficult to trim very small increments of this thick felt accurately and neatly, so you have to do it right the first time. So many of these material wrangling techniques were new, doable, but difficult. So there was often some adrenaline involved and a lot of self-congratulation when I successfully completed the steps in the process that could mean a lot of waste of material or time if I had to redo them. Plus, it's satisfying to see things exist that started out as an idea. So here are the tangible results of the Holdables idea. 47 in all at this point, although I'll admit I've made a few more since the show opened. They range in size from couch scale down to about a loaf of bread. Some are firm, some are squishy, some have no stuffing at all, and many can be worn on the head, it turns out. These are their formal studio portraits. They really come alive in dialogue with each other and visitors in the museum, as you'll soon see. When all the making was done, I again had helpers for the task of measuring, vacuuming, photographing, and bagging the finished Holdables. Documenting the Holdables was one of the last tasks as the date for installation approached, but throughout the whole process, photos were important for record-keeping purposes, to promote and communicate the intent of the exhibition, and to note how everything looked before being set loose among the public to be touched. Installation day arrived just before the winter holiday break in 2019. To transport the work, the museum rented a truck and we loaded it up with plastic-bagged sculpture. It was disconcerting to see how quickly over 2 years' worth of artwork could be removed from my studio and how big and empty it looked afterwards. The Saisset Museum is only a 10-minute drive from my downtown studio. The museum staff includes a lot of students, and we quickly unloaded into the auditorium and then into each of the 2 galleries. Installation itself was pretty straightforward, especially for the Holdables. It was just a matter of placing the thick felt floor pieces I made and unwrapping the sculpture, since it would constantly be moved around and rearranged by visitors. I also had plexiglass mirrors installed along one wall. For the hanging pods in Gallery 2, Chuck Splady and his team arrived with the steel armatures and set them up in place. We had to decide on site about the final locations and cable lengths for each hanging pod, and then over the next few days it was a matter of attending to details like finalizing lighting. I also spent some time covering over the hooks that suspend the hanging pods from the steel framework. I wrapped wool roving over and around them, then needle felted it in place to unite with the felt covering the cables. I wanted it to look like these mysterious objects had been organically bound to the man-made structure. It all seemed almost too easy, but I think that indicates all the preparation that went on beforehand. At last, everything was ready. The sculpture was in place, invitations had gone out, hand sanitizer dispensers were installed outside each gallery, and this is even before COVID-19. It really sunk in that this was all finally happening when I saw the official signage up outside the museum. Excitement was high and it was time to welcome the human element. The opening reception of InTouch was a happy blur for me, as these things tend to be. It was incredibly well attended. In addition to my friends and family, there was a huge turnout of the volunteers and financial supporters of the project, coming to see the results and celebrate. Art receptions tend to offer a very different experience of the art due to all the bodies present. For this hands-on exhibition, that meant a lot of high-energy engagement, which at first was a little nerve-wracking, even though I aimed to over-engineer the sculpture to make sure it was durable. That first night felt like a test, and everything held up well. I found it both gratifying and strange to see visitors getting physical with the art. That was the plan all along, of course, but I hadn't pictured quite so many people all at once, and some of the ways people interacted with my work was delightfully surprising. It was interesting to see the reactions to the art, and the reactions to the reactions to the art. The 2 neighboring installations felt markedly different from each other in spite of their shared touchability. The hanging pods were a somewhat familiar presentation of artworks, with the unusual option to indulge curiosity through tactile examination and hugs. The focus was on the art objects themselves. The Holdables gallery was filled with activity. Visitors instantly understood that they could test the sculptures and explore what they felt like and how they could be arranged or worn. In this installation, the focus was more on what a participant could do with the art objects. In my subsequent visits to the show, I was always interested in observing visitors' reactions to the art and each other. The idea behind InTouch was that the experience of physically interacting with novel artworks would create a sense of connection with the art, with each other, with a feeling of wonder and being present. Reports from friends and strangers seemed to support that. From what I saw, the experience definitely seemed to vary depending on certain factors, being solo versus visiting with a friend, or in a group, whether anyone was already in the gallery engaging in a particular way with the art, and the age of the visitors, kids being much more comfortable with getting hands-on, adults feeling different degrees of inhibition and then delight at overcoming it. I think a lot of it came down to the idea of vulnerability. Do you feel trusting enough to let down your guard and interact with unusual, unfamiliar things in public? With the hanging pods, you have permission to touch objects that are vaguely body-like that can't touch back. Does that bring up anything about your own body or other people's? There's a performative and voyeuristic aspect to the Holdable sculptures that put the visitor in a creative but vulnerable role. Do you feel self-conscious about doing it right? To express curiosity and openness about new experiences, objects, and people takes guts. It's easier to be cool and unaffected. The thing about vulnerability is that it means being brave and putting yourself at risk, even if it's just the risk of feeling silly. But doing that alongside other people doing the same thing is another way to break down barriers and build connections. I think InTouch provided a safe place to do that, without being obvious about it. So even with its debut unexpectedly shortened, I think InTouch has been worth it. The response to making, handling, and interacting with these big, mysterious sculptures has reinforced that there's something about the experience that people yearn for and appreciate. I know I've gotten a lot out of this project too. I've successfully experimented with new art-making techniques. I've learned the value of community involvement in terms of both production and new relationships. I've managed all aspects of an ambitious, large-scale project, and now I know I could do it again. Together, my team has created sculptures to be proud of. And I've satisfied some of my curiosity about what would happen if I actually brought this crazy touchable art idea to life. And it's not over. As the world comes back from social distancing, I know we'll find ways to indulge in our human desire to touch, trust, and connect. Hope may not be a plan of action, but it is a state of mind. One of my hopes going forward is that the next presentation of InTouch is something you'll get to experience in person.